Welcome to this RC Basic video that's really just going to be over scope. I looked at the last few videos and I realized that I haven't really explained scope too well. I know a lot of expert programmers probably already know this, and you could pretty much just skip over this video entirely. But I would suggest maybe just glancing over it, because I'm going to be doing things specific to the RC Basic programming language. So I'm going to start by creating some variables, use public. So I'll use like I equals 0, n equals 5, and I'll create a string. So I'll call this string like txt, short for text, equals, and then pit random text in our string. Now that we got these variables created, I'm gonna go ahead and say right now, like, scope works on like different levels. So these variables right now are since they are not created inside of a loop or inside of a function or a subroutine, they are in a global scope, so they can be accessed by any function, subroutine, or loop within your program. So for instance, I could go inside of like create a function. We'll call this function just my function, and inside this function I can say print I. Well, I0, so print n, or print txt. I'll go with that, print txt, and I'm going to I'm going to return just 0. I don't really care about the return value of this function for the purpose of this example. So when I use my function, and system pause there. Sorry about my typing, but I am actually not that great at typing. So what this is going to do is, since this function is in the global scope, and this variable is in the global scope, and it was created before this function can access this variable. So this will write random text to the screen, because when we use my func here, it's going inside of here and we're printing txt, which was created right there. So let's run that. We get random text. The reason I start off with that is because now I'm going to create another function called my function 2. I'm not going to be super original names right here. Print txt here, and we'll just return 0 again, and in function. This should not compile, simply because we're trying to print txt here, but we haven't made a variable called txt yet. It doesn't get created till here. Even though this variable is in a global scope, it can only be accessed by functions, loops, and subroutines that are created after the variable is created here. So this function was created after we created the variable here, so it could access that variable. But since this function starts on line 1 and we haven't created txt here, this will fail to compile. Even if we didn't call my function 2, it would fail to compile just because the variable doesn't exist here. So we try to run that, and we get identifier not defined, and all this, which I'm sorry about these compiler messages. I'm going to fix them in the future release. It's mainly still just like this because this is what I was using to debug it. But we get identifier not defined, and ID, and txt. Well, it's basically saying ID text, which is txt, which is that variable right there. But it's saying identifier not defined, compiler stopped at line 2, which means on line 2 right here, it's looking at this variable and it can't find where this variable is made. And if the variable is not made, then you can't do anything with that variable. So we could do something like gem txt here, and now we've created a variable called txt, but we've only created it inside of this function. This variable txt is actually different than this variable txt. They have the same names, but internally, I'm just going to type this out. Internally, this variable right here is actually going to be, since we haven't created a variable in the global scope for this function access, this variable is only created locally to this function, and inside the compiler is going to create a separate variable for that called myfunction2.txt. And this that myfunction2.txt is this variable here. That's the variable that's getting created inside of this function, since it couldn't find a variable that was already made with that name. However, this variable right here internally is just going to be called txt because it was created in the main scope of the program. So now that we've created this variable here, this program will run it. It's not going to print anything because txt doesn't have a value. So now that I've shown that, let's create like txt here and give it a value of hello world. I can't emphasize enough how much I'm going to overuse the hello world thing, just because I can't, I'm not that creative when it comes to thinking of random words. So now we're not even going to create a variable here called txt. So what's going to happen here is now this will fail, simply because we've created this variable txt inside of this function. But this variable right here, since it was created inside of this function, when this function ends, that variable is discarded. It no longer exists. It only exists within this function because it was created inside this function. So when we go here, even though this function was created after this function cannot access variables that were created inside of this function. It could access variables that were created in the main program, like anywhere right here, or if the variable is created somewhere before here, then my function would be able to access that variable, but it's not going to be able to. Oh snap! Erasing wrong stuff. So it's not going to be able to access this variable because it was created inside of this function. Therefore, it can't be accessed outside the function. A variable that's created outside the function, like these variables, they can be accessed inside of any function, loop, or subroutine that's created after it. So now we run this, and we're going to get an error on line 11 because this variable does not exist. And we get a compiler stopped at line 11. And that's just basics of how variables can be accessed. You have to look at when and where you're making the variable, and that determines where it can be accessed, in and outside the function. So random stuff. Now we've created a variable here, and it will run that now because this variable was created inside of the global scope, so it can be accessed within this function. And we get hello world. We got hello world because remember here we haven't even run my function. We made a function called my function, but we didn't actually run it. So it's not printing this variable which was created here. We're going to my function 2, creating a variable called txt here, which is equal to hello world, running that, and then returning 0. If that wasn't all that explanatory, just look like play around with it a little bit, look at some of the examples included with RC Basic, as well as I've posted more stuff within the forums, and look at the documentation, which I do go over scope in the documentation. There's a whole section on it right here, which is not super comprehensive, but it's just basically gives you a gist of what it is. Now let's go a little bit one other thing with scope I wanted to go over is reference. Basically, I'm gonna get rid of all this, get rid of all that, and I'm going to so I don't have to return anything. I'm just going to create a subroutine this time, and I'm going to call it my sub, and I'm going to create a variable for it called n. Now I'm going to say n equals 5, n sub. So this is taking a value n, which is a number, and is setting that number equal to 5. So let's say we wanted to, let's create a variable here called x equals 0, and then we do my sub x and print x. Now if this at this point, if you don't understand what this is trying to do, I would highly suggest watching my first video, Intro to RC Basic for beginners, which I'll have a link to that in the description. But here we're creating a subroutine called my sub, and inside the sub we're taking one parameter n, and we're trying to set n equal to 5. So then we create a variable here called x, and we set it equal to 0. And then we pass x to my sub. So x is being passed as n. So x should be getting set to 5 here. But if we print x, x is going to be 0. And I'll run that, show it, and then I'll explain why. And we get 0. And the reason that is because variables are automatically passed by value and not by reference. And by that I mean, this isn't passing the variable x to my sub. This is passing the number 0 to my sub. It's passing the value in x, but it's not passing x itself. And that's because we are only accepting a value here. If we wanted to accept this variable by reference, we have to use the by ref keyword. So by ref n. And now when a variable is passed to my sub, it's being passed by reference. So instead of passing the value of that variable, we're passing the entire variable itself, which means we can still access the value of that variable, but now we can also change the value of the variable inside the subroutine. So now when we do n equals 5 and we pass x to my sub, it's going to set x equal to 5 here because x is being passed as n. So now when we print x, it should print 5. And we get 5. That's it for this video. It was just a quick video, going a little bit more in scope because I didn't feel I could go over scope thoroughly, and it's a very important subject, and so I wanted to give it its own video. Please go to rcbasic.com, check out and to download RC Basic along with all the documentation, and RC Basics free software, open source and available under the MIT license as of right now. I'm thinking about switching that license to zlib because zlib is a less restrictive license than MIT, and I really do want RC Basic to be shared freely. So anybody who has any suggestions on the licensing terms and trying to make this as unrestricted as possible, please contact me on RC Basic forums or by email, which you can access my email on the RC Basic website, link in the description. And that's it. I will check y'all in the next video.